My name is Alexander, and in this short documentary I'll be exploring a controversial subject. Now, as a media student, I've witnessed and studied the many different forms of media in the current electronic entertainment landscape. Among them, video games are a relatively new form of entertainment that has slowly become ubiquitous. Almost every family owns some sort of video game console or interacts with a video game in some way, shape or form. From mobile phone apps to computers specifically designed for this task, video games are now everywhere. But how popular they are is not my question. My question is, are video games art? Now, this is a topic of discussion that I've been wondering about for quite some time. I could simply say video games are an art form and leave it at that. But why? What makes them an art form? What even is art? All these questions I'm hoping to answer today in this documentary. As someone who plays games frequently, I have often felt the need to justify the inherent value of video games against backdrops of accusations that they are simply irrelevant entertainment, or in some cases, potentially dangerous. And this makes it difficult to convince people that they could truly be an art form. I carried out specific research to answer this exact question. I visited the British Film Institute Library in central London with some of my classmates, I interviewed certain individuals about their opinions and views on video games, and I sampled quotes from articles by famous film critics. But before we dive into this controversial subject matter, let me ask you a question. What is art? According to Google, art is the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination, typically in a visual form such as a painting or sculpture, producing works to be appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power. It's quite a mouthful. I asked my interviewees what they thought art was. Here are some of their responses.
Art is anything that we create or in some way focus our attention on that gives us some emotional feedback.
Art is a poetic expression, if you like, of human experience and the real or the abstract or what have you.
Art is basically, it's expressing something and it tries to tell a story.
Art is something that is created by someone. There doesn't necessarily have to be a proper purpose to it, form of expression.
So as you can see, there is no universal opinion on what art is. Art could almost be anything. Movies themselves are considered art these days. There are many examples of movies that I could consider art. But how can video games be considered art? Taking a step back, video games and film are a very similar form of media. There is no doubt that film is considered art these days, and definitely not a waste of time. We can consider video games in the same way. Games follow a lot of the same techniques films do, something that I've studied and analysed quite closely in the years that I've been studying film. There's no denying the intricacy and level of detail that has to be poured into video games released these days. To truly comprehend the medium's utter potential as an art form, I had to interview two individuals, both of whom had dabbled in games design, who I thought would have a true and real perspective on what makes games an art form.
Video games are an art form. They're a key art form because they include everything else in them. There is painting, there are textures, there is design, concept art, there is sculpture, there is model building. There is a whole range of techniques and art forms that are brought into it. Games can be cinema, they can be abstract, they can be surrealist. Everything in them has to be designed, created, thought about, textured, rendered, given physical properties so that it can shatter or break or move. So a game is a much bigger and wider form, there's many forms of art inside it.
I think they're an art form because they provide something that films and television and books do not, which is interactivity. You know, as technology has progressed, video games used to be very simple, and then eventually they turned to pixels where they resembled actual characters. And then as technology progressed, there was more that could be done with the hardware. You interact with the world around you, and that's not really something you can get through watching a movie. I'm not trying to say they're less superior forms of entertainment, but with video games, that's what's unique about them.
Video games immerse the player in a world that takes you out of yourself, or even just to kill a few hours, similar to how you might watch a film or read a book. Some believe that the interactivity takes away from being able to appreciate games as an art form.
There's artistry involved, no doubt, but they're not consumed as regular art would be consumed, seen, heard, what have you, but not interactive. Maybe that's the problem I have with computer games. It's interactive, and somehow that takes away from the art.
Of course, there have been many arguments against video games as an art form, the most infamous of which being from the film critic Roger Ebert, who famously stated, "To my knowledge, no one in or out of the field has ever been able to cite a game worthy of comparison to the great dramatists, poets, novelists, and composers. For most gamers, video games represent a loss of those precious hours we have available to make ourselves more cultured, civilized, and empathetic."
I would probably disagree with what he said about video games. It's funny in a way because when TV was first around, people kind of disregarded it a bit and went, oh yeah, if you watch TV all day it'll rot your brain. Even going back to when cinema was first around, that at first wasn't accepted as a proper art form. Roger Ebert, famous film critic, he grew up with the movies. I reckon people growing up with these video games, it will inevitably be put on the same sort of level.
Ebert's view on video games was very kind of blinkered as to what they are or what they were when he saw them. So who knows when that interview was done, it may have been he just saw Pac-Man. So there's so much more you can do in video games, and there's so many things, like there's educational games, virtual realities for people who've got injuries. It's kind of like saying that film isn't art because it's just a piece of film.
Roger Ebert stated that no one can cite any good games to compare to the great arts. However, there are lots of games that show the medium's artistic potential. I would like to review one example in particular, a now infamous video game called Spec Ops: The Line. On the surface, the game appears to be nothing more than your generic run-of-the-mill military shooter. Indeed, it was advertised as such. However, peeling away the generic packaging that covers the game, you slowly start to realise what the game is truly about. What follows once you reach Dubai is nothing short of a psychological horror narrative that slowly breaks apart the conventions of both video game stories and stereotypical military tales. Spec Ops: The Line has all the makings of a genuinely great piece of art. It has highly metaphorical, symbolic imagery, a disturbing, realistic story which has a commentary on the human psyche, and it uses its medium in a unique and engaging way. Simple things such as loading screens are used to convey a whole new meaning to the story, and there's tons of foreshadowing and subtleties that can be picked apart from the narrative. If Spec Ops: The Line was a movie, it simply wouldn't land the way it does as a game, because the interactivity is the core of the story. Now, I won't spoil the ending of the game, but it certainly left me thinking, and thinking hard about everything that the game had been about. It made me feel emotional because of its impact. I felt like I had a more personal connection to the story and characters because I myself had engaged with the medium. I had interacted with it, in other words. The measure of art is often that it has an impact by connecting with people. Games connect with people through providing a form of escapism. Some interviewees had some interesting comments on the impact of games on their lives.
It actually stemmed from my desire to play video games in high school. I didn't enjoy a lot of the higher level subjects such as physics and maths, although I was relatively good at it. So I found Minecraft and Terraria, a lot of these video games, to be a form of escapism. Eventually culminated into an interest for architecture as I started to research into building techniques and ways I can design my buildings to look better.
In my case, from suffering with severe depression and anxiety, video games are a good way of forgetting you suffer. Like, a big part of my mental health was losing my father when I was 17, and a good way of coping with that for me is to play all the games I used to play with him when I was younger.
And there are lots of games where, trying to explain it to somebody who's not interested or hasn't invested time in playing it, it's pointless. You could have actually been out farming or, making a garden look nice or building something positive. So a lot of people don't see that building something in a fake world can be just as important to somebody who's got no power or ability to do that in the real world.
The medium can be used for almost anything. It may take a great many years before the medium is finally accepted as an art form, but rest assured it will happen. They are one of the most interesting and unique ways of captivating and engaging an audience that exists currently.